Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. In the early 2000s, researchers looked at the DNA of children living in state-run orphanages in Romania, and they found something terrifying.
Yeah, terrifying is really the right word for it.
Right, because the trauma of that highly stressful institutional environment, well, it wasn't just in their minds. It had literally, physically eaten away at the ends of their chromosomes.
It's really a profound study. It forces a total reevaluation of what a chromosome actually is, you know?
Welcome to this custom deep dive. Today we're acting as your study buddies, taking you on a journey into the molecular reality of your genetic code.
Exactly, because we usually think of DNA as this pristine, untouchable vault, like a master blueprint locked away in a secure server, just dictating who you are.
You inherit it, it builds you, and it stays perfectly preserved. But, that Romanian orphanage study completely shatters that illusion.
It does. We like to think of our genetic code as something static, entirely protected from the outside world, but the physical structure of your DNA is incredibly dynamic.
It's a biological diary.
Right. It absolutely carries a record of your genetic legacy, dictating your traits, but its physical shape records the stresses we encounter.
So the children who remained in the stressful environment of the orphanage, they had significantly shorter telomeres.
Those are the physical protective caps on the ends of their chromosomes.
Right, shorter telomeres between the ages of 6 and 10 compared to the kids who were moved out to foster care. Their environment chemically altered their fundamental architecture.
Which is it's staggering to think about.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is understanding how this massive amount of information is stored, accessed, and protected in your cells, straight from Chapter 11 of our genetics text.
And to understand how the physical shape of our DNA records our life's trauma, we first have to understand the impossible physics of fitting this much information into a microscopic cell.
It's like taking an enormous terabyte-sized zip file, compressing it so tightly it fits on a drive the size of a grain of sand, but you still need to open and read specific documents inside that file at a moment's notice.
That is the perfect analogy. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, let's look at a simple bacterium.
Okay, let's do it.
A single cell of E. coli has about 4.6 million base pairs in its circular DNA molecule. If you were to take that DNA out and stretch it into a straight line,
it'd be huge, right?
It would be 1,000 times longer than the E. coli cell itself. It is the ultimate storage problem.
Humans are vastly more complex. Your cells contain over 6 billion base pairs of DNA.
Yeah, the numbers get absurd quickly.
If you stretched out the DNA from just one single human cell end to end, it would measure over 2 meters long. That is over 6 feet of genetic material.
In every single microscopic nucleus.
Right. Even the DNA in our absolute smallest human chromosome would stretch 14,000 times the length of the cell nucleus it's supposed to live in.
So how do you cram 6 feet of material into microscopic space without turning it into an unusable, tangled mess?
I always picture twisting an old school telephone cord.
Yeah.
Or taking a rubber band and just twisting it between your fingers.
Yes, exactly.
Eventually, the tension gets so high that the rubber band loops back and twists over on itself, right? It shrinks in length to save space.
Geneticists formalize that exact specific type of tension as supercoiling. It's the most fundamental level of packaging.
So how does supercoiling actually work at the DNA level?
Well, in its most relaxed, lowest energy state, the classic bDNA double helix has about 10 base pairs per complete turn.
Okay, 10 per turn.
Right. But if the cell uses energy to add or remove any of those turns, it places physical strain on the molecule.
So it's winding it tighter or looser.
Exactly. If you add turns and over-rotate the helix, you get positive supercoiling. If you remove turns and under-rotate it, you get negative supercoiling.
But I imagine the cell doesn't just let the DNA twist randomly on its own.
No, the process is highly regulated by enzymes called topoisomerases.
Topoisomerases?
Yeah, they act like molecular magicians. They will temporarily break the DNA strands, physically rotate the ends around each other to add or remove a turn, and then seamlessly rejoin the broken ends.
That's wild. So it actually cuts the DNA to twist it.
Literally cuts it, twists it, pastes it back together. And most of the DNA found inside your cells is intentionally maintained in a state of negative supercoiling.
Meaning the cell goes out of its way to keep the DNA slightly under-rotated. Why is that the preferred state?
Well, it's a brilliant evolutionary solution for two distinct reasons. First, supercoiled DNA takes up vastly less physical space than relaxed DNA. It folds up much tighter.
Makes sense, like the twisted rubber band.
Right. But second, because negative supercoiling means the DNA is under-rotated, the two strands are experiencing a slight unwinding tension.
Oh, I see.
So when the cell eventually needs to replicate the DNA or separate the strands to transcribe a gene, it requires significantly less energy to pull those strands apart.
Because it's already under-rotated.
Exactly. The helix is already primed and essentially begging to be opened.
Tightly packed, but primed and ready. That is so elegant. Now, that handles a simple bacterial cell where this twisted DNA just forms a distinct clump called the nucleoid.
Yeah, just a series of twisted loops held by proteins.
But human cells and all eukaryotes, we have a true nucleus. And we have massive linear chromosomes. So we have an even bigger packaging problem.
We do. Moving chronologically through eukaryotic evolution, the DNA does not float around naked inside the nucleus. It is intimately associated with highly specialized proteins forming a complex structure we call chromatin.
And there are different types of chromatin, right?
Right. There are two main types, euchromatin and heterochromatin. Euchromatin condenses and decondenses with the cell cycle, and that's where most of the active transcription happens.
It's the active stuff.
Yeah. But heterochromatin remains highly condensed basically all the time. It's characterized by a lack of transcription, no crossing over, and you find it permanently at centromeres, telomeres, and actually most of the Y chromosome.
Okay, wait. I want to push back on the chemistry of this for a second because there's a fascinating logistical hurdle here.
Okay, lay it on me.
We know from basic chemistry that DNA is highly negatively charged, right? The entire backbone of the double helix is made of phosphate groups, which carry a negative charge.
That is correct.
So if you try to compress all of this negatively charged DNA into a tiny space, shouldn't those negative charges violently repel each other? How do you get the DNA to stick to proteins tightly enough to fold up into these massive structures without the whole thing pushing itself apart?
It's a great question. The cell relies on a group of proteins called histones. There are 5 major types: H1, H2A, H2B, H3, and H4.
And they solve the charge problem.
They do. They're incredibly rich in 2 specific amino acids, arginine and lysine. Both of those amino acids carry a strong positive charge.
Oh, wow. So they act like magnets.
Exactly. The histone proteins have a powerful net positive charge, which attracts the negative phosphates of the DNA backbone. Opposite charges attract.
That makes perfect sense. So instead of repelling, the DNA clings to these proteins. So if we build this step by step for the listener, step 1 is what we call the nucleosome. Imagine taking a very long piece of thread and wrapping it tightly around tiny, positively charged magnetic spools.
Spot on. You have 145 to 147 base pairs of DNA wrapping about 1.65 times around an octamer.
Which is just a core of 8 histone proteins, right? 2 each of H2A, H2B, H3, and H4.
You got it. And if you take a specialized electron microscope and look at it, it literally looks like beads on a string.
Step 2 involves the spaces between the beads.
Yeah, between each nucleosome spool, there is a short stretch of free-floating linker DNA, about 30 to 40 base pairs long.
And the 5th histone, H1, sits there.
Right. H1 acts like a molecular clamp. It locks the coiled DNA securely in place so it cannot unspool.
But the packaging doesn't stop there. Step 3, those locked nucleosomes then fold up on themselves to produce a much thicker 30-nanometer fiber.
And then for step 4, that fiber forms 300-nanometer loops, which are anchored in place by proteins.
Then finally, step 5. Those loops compress into a 250-nanometer fiber, which tightly coils into the dense 700-nanometer chromatid we actually see in a microscope when a cell divides.
It's a massive amount of folding. But what's fascinating here is how organized it is. It's not just a chaotic bowl of spaghetti.
It kind of sounds like spaghetti, though.
Right, but during interphase, large regions of this chromatin form spatial neighborhoods called topologically associated domains, or TADs.
TADs.
Yeah. Within a TAD, the DNA doesn't just float randomly. Distant regions of the DNA string are brought into close physical proximity. The cell builds these custom neighborhoods so regulatory enhancers can physically interact with genes that might be thousands of base pairs away on the linear sequence.
That's incredible. But this incredible organization creates a massive flexibility problem.
How so?
If your DNA is locked up in these tight fibers and nucleosomes, how do the transcription enzymes actually get in to read the genes? I mean, if you want to build a protein, you need to read the code, but the code is locked deep inside this dense physical architecture.
Right. The enzymes can't just phase through the proteins. This tells us that chromatin is highly dynamic. It has to change shape.
And we actually have visual evidence of this, don't we?
We do. Proof comes from giant polytene chromosomes in Drosophila, which are fruit fly larvae.
Oh, the giant chromosomes.
Yeah, because certain fruit fly cells replicate their DNA thousands of times without ever dividing the cell. They create these massive, abnormally thick chromosomes, and when researchers stain them, they see these localized swellings.
They call them chromosome puffs, right?
Exactly. The puffs are areas where the tightly packed chromatin has completely relaxed into an open, expanded state. It physically proves active transcription is happening right there in the loosened areas.
There's an enthusiastically clever experiment that proved this chemically, too, using chick embryos.
Oh, the DNA's eye experiment. I love this one.
It's so cool. Researchers wanted to know exactly when the DNA is tight and when it is loose. So they used an enzyme called DNA's eye, which is basically a pair of molecular scissors that just chews up unbound DNA.
If the DNA is wrapped around the histones, it's shielded from the scissors.
Right. So they looked specifically at the globin genes responsible for making hemoglobin. Chickens have an embryonic version of this gene and an adult version.
And they found that when the chick embryo actively needed that embryonic gene, that specific stretch of DNA was highly sensitive to the DNase here.
It got completely chewed up because the histones had literally loosened their grip to let the gene be read. Meanwhile, the adult genes, which the embryo didn't need yet, were perfectly protected.
So the physical structure of the chromosome changes before the gene can be read.
But so what's the actual molecular trigger?
Yeah.
What tells a nucleosome spool to let go?
One of the primary mechanisms is a chemical process called acetylation. The cell deploys specialized enzymes that attach small chemical tags, called acetyl groups, to the lysine amino acids on the histone tails.
And lysine is the one with the positive charge.
Exactly. When you attach an acetyl group, you reduce that positive charge.
It literally turns down the electromagnet. The magnetic attraction weakens, and the nucleosome's grip on the negative DNA loosens.
And the chromatin opens up. This chemical mechanism is actually the foundation of epigenetics.
Which is such a buzzword now.
It is, but at its core, epigenetic changes are stable alterations to our traits that are passed down to descendant cells without ever changing a single letter of the underlying DNA sequence.
Like the coat color of agouti mice.
Right. You can have parent mice with the exact same genetic code for fur color. But because of variations in DNA methylation, a similar chemical tagging process, they can produce offspring with wildly different coat colors.
Ranging from yellow to dark brown. The genetic sequence is absolutely identical.
The physical access to the blueprint is what changed.
The structure of the chromosome is the trait. Okay, so we've talked about the whole fiber. Let's look at the anatomy of specific parts, starting with the middle, the waist of the chromosome.
The centromere.
Yeah. Early experiments showed that if a chromosome accidentally breaks in half, you're left with two fragments.
And the fragment that still contains the centromere safely attaches to the spindle microtubules and moves into the new cell during division.
But the broken fragment that doesn't have a centromere, it fails to attach to the spindle microtubules, and it's just lost during cell division. It degrades. The centromere is essential.
But here is the centromere paradox. In most complex eukaryotes, humans included, centromeres are not defined by a specific DNA sequence.
Wait, really? You can't just read the code and find the centromere?
Nope. Instead, they are defined epigenetically by a variant histone called CENP-A, or CENH3.
An imposter histone.
Exactly. It completely replaces the normal H3 histone in those nucleosomes. This imposter spool alters the physical shape of the chromatin just enough to allow kinetochore proteins to bind.
So it's the altered physical shape, not the DNA sequence, that defines the centromere.
Right.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about the ends of the chromosomes and bring this all the way back to our Romanian orphanage study.
The telomeres.
Yes. Pioneering work by Barbara McClintock and Herman Muller showed that broken chromosomes get sticky. They degrade and fuse together, but natural ends don't.
Because the natural ends have telomeres, which acts like the protective plastic tips on your shoelaces.
And in humans, the telomere is just a repeating sequence, right? A or T, followed by several Gs.
Specifically, it's 5' TTAGGG 3', repeated thousands of times in a row.
But the physical structure is weird. The strand that's rich in guanine is actually longer, creating a 3' overhang.
Yeah, it's a piece of single-stranded DNA just dangling off the edge.
But wouldn't a dangling piece of single-stranded DNA look exactly like broken DNA that needs repairing?
It would. And to protect this dangling end from the cell's repair machinery, a multi-protein complex called shelterin binds directly to it.
It physically shields it.
Exactly. Sometimes that long overhang will actually fold back on itself and tuck its end inside the double helix, forming what's called a T-loop.
Safely tucked away. But there's a massive catch, isn't there?
The end replication problem. Because DNA polymerases can't copy the very end of a linear chromosome, telomers shorten with every single cell division.
They just run out of track.
Right. Now, an enzyme called telomerase can lengthen them, but telomerase is really only active in germ cells and stem cells. Your standard somatic body cells lack it.
So for most of your cells, your telomeres act as a biological countdown clock. Every time the cell divides, the clock ticks down.
And this brings the context right back to why the stressed orphans had shortened biological clocks on their DNA.
The chronic stress accelerated the shrinking of those protective caps. So moving on from the structure, what is actually written in all this DNA? We call it the junk in the trunk.
Well, eukaryotic DNA is divided into 3 major classes, and it turns out most of it isn't what people think.
The first class is unique sequence DNA.
Right. This is DNA present in only one or a few copies in your entire genome. It includes our protein coding genes.
But that's only, 25 to 50% of this specific class, right?
Yep. The rest of the unique sequence DNA doesn't even code for proteins. But this class also includes gene families that arose from duplication.
Like the beta-globin genes clustered on human chromosome 11.
Exactly. Over evolutionary time, extra copies mutated to take on slightly different oxygen transport jobs.
Okay, what about the next class? Moderately repetitive DNA.
These are sequences typically 150 to 300 base pairs long, repeated thousands of times.
Some do important jobs, like making ribosomal RNA and transfer RNA, right?
Yeah, but much of it has no known function at all. They can be tandem repeats, which are clustered together, or interspersed repeats, which are scattered randomly.
And those interspersed ones are fascinating. You have signs, like the 300 base pair ALU sequence, and lines, long interspersed elements.
And just to put this into perspective, line 1 makes up roughly 17% of the entire human genome.
17%. And many of these are just the remnants of ancient transposable elements, right? Basically viral-like jumping genes that multiplied and copied themselves across our ancestors' DNA.
It's wild. Then you have the third class, highly repetitive DNA.
Also known as satellite DNA.
Right. Very short sequences, usually under 10 base pairs, repeated millions of times in tandem blocks.
And these are rarely transcribed into RNA.
Almost never. They primarily cluster around those centromeres and telomeres we just talked about. They form that permanently condensed heterochromatin.
So they're structural. And it's important for you listening to know that genes are not spread evenly across all this.
Not at all.
For example, human chromosome 19 is packed with genes. It has like 26 genes per million base pairs. But chromosome 13 is a ghost town.
Just 6.5 genes per million base pairs.
Yeah, its short arm consists entirely of gene-free heterochromatin, just a structural wasteland.
The architecture is so uneven, but, if we connect this to the bigger picture...
Oh, please do.
We've spent this entire deep dive focused on nuclear DNA. But cells also have DNA in their mitochondria, and plants have DNA in their chloroplasts.
Right, the organelles?
And over evolutionary time, genes have actually moved between these compartments.
Wait, really?
Yeah. There is evidence of chloroplast DNA migrating into the mitochondrial genome and mitochondrial DNA moving into the nucleus. Geneticists literally call this promiscuous DNA.
Promiscuous DNA.
Yeah.
That perfectly shatters the vault metaphor.
Exactly. It shows that the tightly packed, protective chromosome structure we just studied isn't a perfectly sealed vault. Genomes are fluid. They're evolutionarily dynamic.
They're an active ecosystem.
Yeah.
Your DNA is not a static document. It's a living, moving, twisting history. Keep questioning the blueprints of life. Keep asking how these incredible structures shape who we are and how they react to the world around us. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
And next time you think about your DNA, don't picture a sterile blueprint. Picture a biological diary.